Welcome to Optimal Game State. This week we're going to look at one of the big releases from the last year, both for Age of Sigmar generally and for Warcry specifically. The new Cities of Sigmar. Before this big release, we did have rules and models for the Cities of Sigmar, but they were mostly the Empire models from the old world. This is less of a range refresh then, and more of a reimagining. We have all new sculpts for models that never existed before, which is pretty exciting. As of the most recent FAQ, the old profiles are no longer legal, unfortunately. That old list was a big mix of human, dwarfs, and elven profiles that you could pick and mix, put together your perfect list from. Then you selected a city and got warband abilities specific for that city. It's a little bit strange, but it did let us play the old models, which was a lot of fun. The new version is a lot closer to the Warcry we're used to. There are now 3 warbands: the Dispossessed for dwarfs, the Darkling Coven for the dark elves, and the Castelite hosts for the humans, which we're going to be looking at today. This did mean that the Wood Elves and the High Elves have been quietly written out, but on the plus side, hopefully we'll see some of those models re-released for the old world soon enough. At some point, Games Workshop uploaded the new PDF for these warbands, but they never actually had an article about it. At best, there was a small mention of it at the bottom of one of the Warhammer community articles and a note in the FAQ. So for a lot of people, I think this maybe went underneath the radar. Everything on this page now has rules in Warcry. These basically are all the new fancy releases, minus the special characters like the Pontifex, Talia, and the Great Cannon. There are a few of the older models that have stayed, the Box of Flagelites, for example, and the Battle Wizard, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see new models for those coming up in the next year. Going over to the plots, we can see a good spread, as this is a big warband with 22 profiles in total. From the damage plot, we can see the Flagellant and the Whisperblade have some pretty competitive values and are close to the step of their points bracket. So that's the highest damage that you can get for the cheapest points, basically. The Archknight and the Marshal are both in that weird mid-cost area, where damage has flattened off, but they do look decent all the same. Wounds for the most part is good. There are a few low points that we'll try to keep an eye out for. Thankfully, the Steel Helm has decent health to go along with its fine damage. Thematically, this should be the core fighter for the warband, and they arrive in boxes of 10, so we'll want to check them out. Unlike other warbands, where we have a few core abilities, the Cities of Sigmar only have 2 abilities that anyone in the warband can use. They have a quad, which we'll see in a minute, and this reaction. Any fighter can trigger this reaction if they're being attacked, but before dice are rolled, and while they're within 3 inches of another fighter with either a bulwark or elite runemark. If the nearby fighter has bulwark, the defenders get +1 toughness. If they have elite, the defender gets a slightly boosted counter. Counter normally does 1 damage on a miss, and 2 if they roll a 1, but this version does 2 on any miss. If the nearby fighter has both, then both trigger, which is really nice. To peek ahead, the Steel Helms have Bulwark, the Fusiliers have Elite, the Marshals can be built with one or the other, and the only model to have both is the Fusel Major on Ogre Warhawk. The Elite or Bulwark fighters can be an ally, so you can look for Order fighters with the Elite runemark. Unfortunately, there aren't any options with both runemarks, but the Gorgai, a ranked Questor, and the Vulcan Rune Fodder are all very good elite fighters. As with all reactions, you have to consider the cost of giving up an action to use it. While plus toughness can help you try save the fighter, the extra damage from that boosted counter is going to be a lot more interesting. The quad is Fur the Dawn, which will add 2 to the move and attacks of a fighter. This cannot be used by a fighter with the hero runemark. A quad would normally let you move and attack, so you'd need a very specific profile to have this ability do more for you. If all you wanted to do was move, and the quad value was less than 4, then this would be better than Rampage. If you wanted to double attack, and already were in combat, and your fighter has 3 attack dice or less, then this would be slightly better than Rampage. Pretty specific situations, especially when you factor in the hero restriction, but it's not completely useless. Alright, we'll start with the Fusel Major on Ogre Warhawk. Coming in at 245 points, this is pretty expensive. The damage is good, but not amazing. The melee profile is worth about 160 points. The range damage is nice to have, but not really why you take this fighter. At 6 toughness though, and 35 wounds, this is an incredibly hard fighter to take down. As we've already talked about, this does let nearby fighters trigger the reaction at maximum effect, which is really nice. We also have 2 abilities we can use. The first is Castelite formation, a double that will give +2 toughness to your friendly Castelites within 3 inches. That will include this fighter, and as we'll see later, the Steel Helm start at 4 toughness, so with some decent positioning, you can make it very hard for your opponent to do damage. The second ability is a triple Take Aim, which will add 1 to the range crit damage of nearby cities' elite fighters, so that's mostly going to be Fusiliers. In theory, you could stack this across multiple fighters if you had multiple triples, but you're still hoping for crits, and the fighters that it will affect only have 2 dice at range, so most likely this ability isn't going to do anything. Overall, a pretty interesting fighter. It can power up a defensive reaction, which is really interesting. In a perfect case, the Warhulk gets to use the Castelite formation, and then the nearby fighters all get to react for net +3 toughness, doing 2 damage when your opponent misses. Nice. Next up, let's look at the Free Guild Cavalier Marshal and the Free Guild Cavalier Archknight. Basically, the same fighter at different points costs. It's 205 for the Archknight, and then for an extra 50 points you get +2 wounds and almost +3 average damage. The points are pretty chunky, and that's kind of typical for cavalry figures, which have lots of movement and wounds. I do think the damage of the Archknight is a little too low for the points. Yes, this is a fast unit, and is broadly consistent in line with similar units, but that damage is very low. The wounds are consistent with the points cost, so you're essentially paying for the high movement by halving the damage. The Marshal is a better deal, even if you are spending a little bit more on it. Both have the same ability, for Sigmar, Charge. This is a double version of Inspiring Presence, but you only can apply it to another cavalry model. So here we can double up with 2 cavalry fighters and get a pretty devastating double damage turn. That will of course depend on what the average damage of our next fighter is. The Free Guild Cavalier is a pretty straightforward fighter, no special abilities or anything strange, just 9 movement doing an average of 4 damage. I think this does in part show the problem with the previous Cavalier Archknight. We're down just half a point of average damage and we've saved 40 points. Again, the wounds are consistent with the points, so the speed is basically being paid for here with damage reduction. 5 toughness and 20 wounds is still pretty decent, but unfortunately there's nothing really exciting about this model. If it did more damage, the combo with the charge ability might be worth it, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Outside of allies, these cavalry options are the only fighters above move 4 in this warband. So even if we're not seeing a ton of damage for it, you definitely could justify its inclusion in the warband. Moving away from the cavalry, we have 3 options for the Free Guild Marshal, which we'll go through now. The first option here is a double-handed weapon with no shield. Here it's been built as a hammer, but the kit can also do a sword or even 2 melee weapons. This is a pretty great profile with good wounds and damage both over what you'd expect for the points costs. We also have a decent ability, the double rousing speech, which will add +1 dice to nearby fighters. The wording says other, which means it doesn't apply to this fighter. I think this is a change in the wording templates, as previous abilities like this would have said visible, which did cause some confusion, as fighters not being visible themselves is a weird rules technicality that seems funny when you look at your own hands. The ability does only work on other Cities of Sigmar Castelite host fighters, so unfortunately you're not going to be able to boost your allies, so it is kind of limited to what you have in the warband. The other option to go for is the shield. Damage has dropped by almost 2, but toughness has increased by 1, and other fighters can now target the Marshal for a toughness reaction. It also opens up the double to increase toughness of nearby fighters by 2, which is a little bit more important. This is how I built my own Marshal before the rules came out, and I think I would have been happier with the heirloom weapon. Notably, you can also build this kit with 2 shields for maximum tanking. The last option is the Duellist, which is a ranged fighter. I do think it's nice to see the melee attack lowered on the range. That suggests that the actual investment on this profile is in the range stack. We always end up comparing range fighters against the Kradron Overlords, who are the kings of it. If we filter out the move 3 fighters though, we can see that the Marshal is comparable to Demolisher with Flame Hurler from the Horns of Hashut, who is a very good fighter. The Marshal is 25 points more, but does have nearly double the wounds for that. So yeah, I think this is a pretty good fighter. In addition, the Duelist has the Elite runemark, which means nearby fighters can get that counter reaction as an option, and that is big. This kit is very, very flexible. I'd suggest building it whoever you like the look of, but if you want to optimize it, you could go for one melee weapon and one range weapon to cover both of those options, and then just let your opponent know which one to advance. As I've already built the shield version, I think I might try my luck and say that the weapon is a heirloom sword, but outside of casual play, that would be something I would need to check ahead of time with a tournament organizer if I was bringing it to an event. All right, next up we have the Alchemite Warforger. Again, we're seeing the range attack better than the melee, which is really nice. So this is a fighter that you really want to get in position and then try not move. So you can then do that average 3 damage across 2 separate attacks in a turn. Wounds are pretty good for the points, and the range attack is decent. We do have a triple, Blazing Weapons. Unfortunately, it's not great. You get to pick a target, and their crits are increased by 2. Pretty simple. Essentially, that's 0.3 extra damage per attack dice for your target. So you really want to find a fighter with the most attacks possible, and maybe give them a few extra dice using Onslaught or something like that. Unfortunately, you can't do this on allies coming from outside the warband, so you've kind of got a hard cap on targets based on the fighters in this warband. It also only applies to the next melee attack, so it's a really limited ability. And looking through the options, you're probably at best targeting a 4 attack dice fighter, and that bonus is going to be a flat 1.2 extra damage, which isn't great for a triple. Arguably, there is some potential if you're able to stack with the rousing speech ability and an onslaught. That's going to increase by an extra 2 dice, which will be an extra 0.6. But, it's still a triple, and you're not getting a lot out of it, I think. The Battle Mage is almost identical to the Alchemist Warforger, which does make sense, as the Warforger is basically a mage specializing in metal magic. The General Battle Mage is slightly cheaper, losing 1 toughness, but gaining reach, and apart from that, is basically similar. The ability also boosts damage. In this case, it is boosting the attack characteristics of nearby friendlies by 1, which is rousing speech, but in this case, it's a quad rather than a double. So, yeah, not great. The next 3 fighters I'm going to be looking at are part of this Free Guild Command Core box. I mention this because all but the Archer are normal fighters, so you could in theory take an entire warband full of them. To do that, though, you would have to pick up multiple copies of the box. It is a really great kit. The minis are full of character, and they can actually be built in a couple of different ways. But I think the best you're going to get out of it are 2 distinct models for each profile. And then saying that, I think the Gargoyleon can only be built in one way. Anyway, keep that in mind. The first profile we're going to look at is the Arch Knight, who I think is an absolutely amazing looking model. For the profile, this is basically the Marshal with heirloom weapon, but 35 points cheaper, losing 2 damage and 5 wounds. Wounds and damage are both slightly above what you expect for the points. Unfortunately, there's this weird thing about this points cost. There are fighters here that do similar damage for about half the points. From about 80 to 120, the top damage isn't really changing, you see. So often you're looking at models like this, and you're kind of hoping you get a little bit more out of them. To be fair, that double rousing speech is actually great. You'd normally expect an ability like this to be a triple. If you had a Marshal and an Arch Knight, that means you could give +2 attack dice to any fighter within 6 inches of both, which could be really good. So yeah, it's a mid-range fighter, which is worrying, and the ability only benefits Castelite fighters, so you're not going to be able to boost an ally. And the warband doesn't have any big high damage units. That said, it could be a great fighter to stack those bonuses, and we're working into some sort of combined arms warband here, I think. Next up, we have the Great Herald. Although I'd imagine you could use the normal banner bearers from the Steel Helm boxes, which I guess are just average heralds. Damage is good for the points, and the wounds are a little above average. The ability is very, very interesting. Abilities that boost movement can be great, and in this case, on turn 1, you can move the Great Herald first, keeping that 6 inches range, and then trigger the ability. And then the rest of the battle group, or any other fighters nearby, get a free move. For most fighters in this warband, as we've talked about before, you're looking at 4 move. Now, I had initially thought that you had to make the bonus move towards the Herald, But the Warcry Discord has corrected me and pointed out that as long as the fighters moving end up like 0.1 of an inch closer than they were when they started, it's valid. So this is a lot better than I thought, because you can cut weird angles, get your maximum move, and then as long as you make sure you're slightly closer to the Herald, you're still good. Yeah, you can get a lot of action efficiency out of this, a lot of bonus moves. The base size for the Herald is 28 millimeters, so the radius of this bubble is around 6.5 inches, which only needs to clip a friendly model to give them a bonus move. That's pretty generous. Since triples tend to be one a turn, it's likely that one Great Herald is going to be enough. You could run two of them to cover more area and give you more options. That said, I have been reliably informed that one Great Herald is basically an auto-include this warband. Third in the box is the Whisper Blade, which I absolutely love. Damage and wounds are well above what you would expect to get for 80 points. The ability is a quad, and all it does is waste your opponent's saved dice. I suspect you'll get a lot more work done using that quad on another ability, but going into a turn 4 while your opponent has no saved wild dice could be significant. There's nothing really fancy about this fighter. It's just some nice numbers and is the most efficient damage per points that you can get in the warband. It is notable that this is not a hero, so you can have a list where you just pack your warband out with as many of these fighters as you can. I'm not recommending it, as it would mean you need to pick up something like 8 of the command core boxes, but it's worth mentioning at this point. All right, next up we have the Soul Shepherd, which is a very weird profile. Great wounds for the points, but the damage is terrible, even with the range option. The ability then is where this particular fighter comes into play. You spend a triple to roll dice equal to the number of your fighters who have taken a wound or died. Then on a 4+, you get a wild dice. I guess this is a way to save up for a big turn. Maybe you use this at the end of turn 2 or turn 3, end up getting 3 or 4 wild dice, and then go into your next turn with tons of the abilities and the initiative, maybe both. Remember, you can't make a double out of 2 wild dice, and you can only improve a group by 1 wild dice. So no making quads from a double. I honestly don't know how good this would be. I have been told that the God Speaker for the Dark Oath Savagers, who has a similar ability to add bonus wild dice at least, isn't great. So yeah, there might be a way to leverage this, but I think this is a fighter I honestly do need to try out and test, and I see what you can kind of get out of it. Then we have the War Surgeon. 60 points is relatively cheap, and the profile is decent for it. Damage is maybe a little lower than we would want, but wounds are high for the points. The key part here, though, I think is the ability, which is a double, restoring d6 wounds to a nearby target. Normally we see abilities like this baked into a fighter, so they have to use it on themselves to get some healing. In this case, we could have a scarier target in front of our enemy to attack while the surgeon patches them up. It might depend on the scenario or how your enemy plays, but if they decide to go for the surgeon, then they're not going after your good stuff, so that's kind of a win, especially if you're near an elite and can use the counter reaction, which is likely to do more damage than the surgeon actually can by attacking. I will say I do like this fighter a lot. Last in the command box, we have the mascot, Gargolian. Gargolian? Again, you only get one of these in the box, although arguably you could take some of those random Gargolians that are scattered across the Cities of Sigmar kits intended to be added to the bases. They might look a little bit weird because they're quite tiny compared to this guy, but, you know, as long as they're on the right base size, it could be fun. As they are beasts, you could consider proxying in some dogs, like from Hexbane's Hunters or the Wilder Core Hunters. It would certainly look the part, although these creatures are slower and tougher than the hounds, so they are a little bit different. The only thing special about these fighters is they're cheap. It does actually have great wounds for the points, and it still has move 4, where many of the cheap fighters would only be 3 move. There are a few fighters that push that damage to 2.5 or even 3 with the Graveguard, but overall this fighter is pretty decent. Okay, we've done the command box, and now we're moving on. We're starting to look at some of the more units, I guess, from the City of Sigmar, starting with the Fusel Sergeant, which is the leader of the Fusiliers. These do have shields, but not the Bulwark runemark, unfortunately. And importantly, they do have the Elite rune, which will open up the counter reaction for nearby fighters. As we'll see in a second, this fighter is almost identical to the normal Fusiliers, but cost 20 more points to get that ability Take Aim. I guess the goal of this is to have all of your Fusiliers in a clump and give them a bit of a damage bonus. But yeah, because they only have 2 dice, as you mentioned earlier, this ends up being way too little, about 0.4 for each Fusilier, and probably not worth it. Moving on to the Fusiliers. This is an appropriately costed fighter, but part of that is a massive tax for that range of 15. Add to this the extra little for the toughness 5, and you end up with some pretty expensive fighters. I am a little biased, as I don't really like the models for these, but it does make for an interesting setup. Let's say you go for 4 of them, which will add up to 480 points, and then you split them into 2 different battle groups. Assuming they can position well early, each group can do 10 damage to any target they can see up to 15 inches away, which is basically half the board. If an enemy closes, they can react due to their buddy and do damage back to the target every time the target misses. And as they've got 5 toughness, that's probably going to happen a lot. That could be a really good starting point for a list. And then you've got another 520 to play around with for the rest. Moving back into the melee, we start with a Prophet, who is the leader of the Flagellants. He's pretty straightforward, decent for the points, and good damage. No special abilities though, and he is going to tie up your hero slot. Similar in many ways to the Whisperblade, although a little bit more expensive, and a more reliable damage profile, even if it does average out to the same. Then we get into the actual Flagellants. Now, there are some rumors that we are due to see an updated version of these, which would explain why they were included in the list among all of the other new models. The current box, which is from the old world, is pretty crazy. It's got lots of options and definitely looks like a customizer's dream kit. Looking at the profile, they have good wounds and damage for the points. We're going to look at the steel helms soon enough, but in comparison, these are slightly more damage for slightly less toughness and no rune marks. They could be a very good chaff unit if you wanted to. Fingers crossed we get some good new kits if they ever come, and yeah, I'm hoping they look good. Alright, next up we have the Sergeant at Arms, which is the leader for the Steel Helms. Damage is a little low for his points, we would have liked 4, but the wounds are pretty much bang on. The numbers are decent overall, and the key part here is the ability. This is the cheapest hero we have with the Castelite formation ability, so if you want to tank up with a battle group, this Sergeant at Arms is a really, really good option. Also, as part of the Steelhelm box, we have the Battle Priests, which featured recently in OverthinkingWarcry.com's list of underrated fighters. The key part here is the Battle Priest is a super cheap ally for any other warband. This particular warband is already struggling, I think, to fit in all of the heroes that it wants to. Looking at the profile, the damage is pretty much as you expect for points, but the 12 wounds are significantly higher than you would normally get. And for 65, you should be getting around 8 wounds. So obviously 12 is a lot. No abilities here. So this is just numbers and not much else. Last, we have what I would consider the core troop for the faction, the Steel Helms. Great wounds for the points. Damage is fine, but we're looking for one average damage for every 25 points. We do have the Bulwark runemark, which means nearby fighters can get that plus toughness as a reaction. Although realistically, plus 1 toughness isn't great. It's really the counters that you're looking for with the elite. Like the Flagellants, and I guess the Gargoylian, they're cheap chaff that will hopefully be able to stand around and not die. And that's where that 4 toughness was coming in. Or at least die slowly. I do think the models are great, and the transfers for the various cities on the shields are fantastic and really make your models pop. Okay, we've gone through every fighter in this warband. There are a few different ways you can approach list building with them. I think it all comes down to these 3 abilities and how you approach them. Not listed here are the Great Herald ability and the War Surgeon's ability. Both fighters, I think, are really, really well costed and also have a great ability. So I would be tempted to include at least one of those in every list. The decision for list building then comes down to the 3 abilities we have in front of us. First, the reaction. And when I'm talking about the reaction, I'm only looking at the elite version for the counter. This can make the cheap fighters really, really dangerous, as they end up being able to do more damage with their reaction than they would with normal attack. Second is Castelite formation, increasing toughness of nearby fighters by 2. That's a big jump. And even with that small 3-inch range, you should be able to get that bonus on a chunk of fighters. And that might be an argument for Steel Helms, because then they're shooting up from that 3 to 5, and 5 is a good number for being a little bit more survivable. Then we have the more offensive double rousing speech, which will give +1 attack dice to your fighters within 6 inches. It does stack, so 2 doubles could make for a very good turn. Unfortunately, this all means you're getting very hungry for the doubles, so keep that in mind. As mentioned, there are a few fighters that I feel like we probably should include from the get-go. So we have the War Surgeon, we have the Great Herald, and we have the Whisper Blade. All have decent points for their wounds and damage. The War Surgeon and especially the Great Herald also have great abilities. I think any list that we start out with, we're probably going to put these 3 in and then, see if we have to remove them further down the line. For the Elite runemark, to allow others to trigger the reaction, we also have a few options in faction. The Ogre, the Marshal with pistols, or the Fusilier. Now, I've left out the Fusilier leader as I don't think the ability is great, and the normal Fusilier gives you everything else but for cheaper. We can, of course, go outside the faction and look for other Order heroes with the Elite runemark. Here I've added in the Gore guy, who is fast and tons of damage, which is a good option for this particular warband. There are also a few others of interest. Personally, I quite like the Questor Soulsworn Duellist, who also has a nice net-like ability. The +2 toughness ability requires both the Bulwark trait and the Hero trait. For that, we have 3 options. The Ogre, again, who is, as we mentioned, the only fighter with Bulwark and Elite, the Marshal with Shield, and the Sergeant at Arms. Defensive abilities aren't always that popular, but they do have a place, so this might be an option where you drop them, but you almost certainly will find a situation in a game where you wish you had it. Then we have the Rousing Speech ability, which requires the Destroyer runemark. This does not require a leader, but unfortunately the only fighters with it are leaders. The Marshal with Heirloom Weapon is fantastic, so he does feel like a solid inclusion. The Archknight is the discounted version of the Marshal, and as such makes a decent inclusion when you're trying to save points and hero slots. Then we have the cheap chaff fighters, who will probably make up the bulk of the warband. We've got the Steelhelm, the War Surgeon, the Flagellite, who are all 60 points. The Steelhelm is a little tougher and has that Bulwark runemark for its trigger off it. War Surgeon has the heal ability, and the Flagellite has a little bit more damage. If you're like me, you'll end up running the Steelhelms, as that's what we get in the box. And although, that might change once we get the updated Flagellite models. I've also included the Whisperblade here, who a little bit more expensive at 80, but does great damage for points. And then we've also got the Gargoylian, who is the cheapest of all at 50 points. All right, let's see how we can pull all of this together. In this first list, we've gone for the Warhawk, with the goal of getting him into the middle of the battlefield. Given his 50mm base size, that's about a 4-inch radius bubble around which any of your fighters can react to get +1 toughness and counter. That Herald should be able to get the Ogre into place early, and later in the game will give us free moves to get our fighters into base-to-base with the enemy. We're then going to use the Marshal and the Archknight to stack some attack dice, and hopefully we can dish out lots of damage with it. Relatively straightforward. We have a game plan, and hopefully it will maybe work. In the second list, we've gone for a totally different approach. Again, we're focusing on the counter reaction, but this time we've set up 2 battle groups as firing platforms, while the third is moving into position to take objectives. Again, it's a relatively straightforward setup. We have all the moving parts we need. The Fusiliers might be vulnerable if engaged, so we'll probably want to screen them with the Steelhelm, keeping them close enough so the Steelhelm will benefit from the Elite runemark. Shooting lists are always going to have trouble when they can't fire into combat, but I imagine with the range 15 for the 4 Fusiliers, there's probably always going to be a target that they can pepper away at. In this third one, we've gone for one of each of the 3 abilities in each group, on the hope that we can pull it all together. I do quite like the Duelist as an ally, and for this list he does have the Elite runemark. The trick with this, of course, is going to be getting the right elements in the right places, but if we do manage to clump it all together, then we can boost toughness by 2, attacks by 1, and give everyone that awesome counter reaction. In those 3 warbands, there were a bunch of fighters that I didn't touch. The mounted troops aren't amazing, but without them, this warband only moves at 4 inches. I haven't included the Soul Shepherd, but it is a model that I do want to test. As with all the abilities, this warband is pretty dice hungry, and it might allow for a really big turn near the end of the game. I've also favoured Steelhelms, as I prefer the models, but the Flagellants might be better overall for the extra damage. Overall, I think this is a fantastic warband, as it's, for the most part, a brand new range of models, and you've got a fantastic selection to pick from and paint up. The command box in particular is full of character, and they're all great for the game. It does end up being a bit expensive though, as you're basically buying a full Age of Sigmar army and then using a handful of the models from it. Personally, I did pick up the release box when it initially came out, and I have just recently picked up the Free Guild Command Core, which I'm going to start painting soon enough. So yeah, I love this new style of the Cities of Sigmar. Also because I was able to pick out Lethus, which is all kind of purples and death, but you can pick any one of the other cities. The rules aren't going to change, but there's going to be a lot of different character, a lot of styles, and you kind of have your opportunities to kind of make this your own warband, unique to you with your own style. So hopefully you enjoyed this overview of it. If you got anything to add, please do. As I said, I've looked through this. I haven't actually put them on the table. I haven't actually played them, as the Warcry Discord has educated me on a few things. I'm sure there's a couple of other elements I missed. So please do put them in the comments and let other people know, so we'll be able to get this warband on the table and have some fun with it. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible two-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.